Good evening, everyone. Back here another day at the Barbershop. Boy, we're back here again because we have a special topic that we're going to talk about by Asian Pacific Heritage Month, which is such an awesome culture and people of things that they have done that is just amazing to learn all the wonderful things that they have done as a group, as a community, as a people. And so proud that we're going to have some experts here talking about it. And also, we're going to talk about how we can collaborate to kill this thing called hate. We have to get hate out of this world. Hate that has no more room or no place to be here anymore. We're going to talk about love and how we can come together and how we can build bridges because that's what we have in common. We have more things in common than we know about than we really realize. As we learn about our history and each other's history, you're going to find out tonight some amazing things that we all have in common. So I'm glad to welcome back my partner, Jerry. Jerry, we missed you. I hope everything is great with you right now. How you doing, my partner?
I'm good. I'm good. I feel great to be back. I'm excited. And it's amazing just to be a part of this conversation. I'm glad to be back with my brothers and my mentors to listen in on a great conversation on just an amazing history. And I love what you said, our history. Sometimes we live in silos and we think we have different histories and we're doing this alone, but this is our history. And how can we be a better ally to this thing called family? And so I'm gonna pass this love down to my big brother, my mentor. Um, Mike, you want to come on and just talk about what's gonna happen today?
Good, thanks. Welcome back, Jerry. Jerry with like the fresh cut and the nice new glasses and looking all dipped for a Thursday session. It's always good to see you, my brother. It's always good to see you, Scott. He took his glasses off. You can put your glasses back on, Jerry. Oh no, you guys said it. You know what I mean? The barbershop is about us coming together. You know what I mean? It's a space for men to talk about anything and all topics and really to be welcoming of all men. And women are welcome in the barbershop and women are welcome to listen to the barbershop. We're not discriminating against anyone in our audience. And so it's good that we're taking this time this month during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month to welcome our brothers and sisters who hail from that particular heritage. So we have some great guests in the chairs, ready to be introduced. And Scott, what you said, I think is a good place when we start off, like that song about where is the love. I think we want to spend some time dwelling in the love, and then you said, how do we kill hate? That, by the way, that is a funny way to put it. That is a funny way to put it. And I think as a man, we're in a lot of conversations where we sometimes, and I don't want to channel too much into like the domestic violence, some of the conversations we have, but sometimes we have a very male energy, very domineering, dominant way of addressing other people in other communities. So I know I'm not criticizing you, and I know that you're saying it in a playful way, but I'm also recognizing it, and I hope other folks in the barbershop are going to play with us when we talk about getting from to the love to stopping the hate. So as we do, sometimes we pull in other colleagues from DYC to join us. This is the DYC Barbershop. So I'm very pleased that today one of the folks chopping it up with us is our own Deputy Chief of Staff, Anthony Eng. So Anthony, welcome to the Barbershop. Introduce yourself to the people. And then Scott, I know you have some people that you want to introduce back as well.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Mike, Jerry, Scott. Really honored to be here as part of the barbershop today. I've definitely appreciated watching some prior ones and happy to be in the chair this month. And, I definitely appreciated when, you and Scott, reached out and said, hey, being as how this is AAPI Heritage Month, why don't we do a special barbershop series on it? And, I really appreciate that as in some ways an act, and not in some ways, but it is act of solidarity, even amongst us as coworkers and colleagues. So I know I was really touched by that, and I appreciate that. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, looking to sharing. I think, as Scott mentioned, we're going to share some stories where there have been work that's done between Asian and Black communities and other communities of color, because I think many of us, I would imagine many of us on this call would agree that one way to stop the hate is to better understand each other and to build true relationships with each other and across communities. And that takes time. We know that takes time, but it's got to start somewhere. So, I really feel like with a lot of the events and discussions this month for Heritage Month and just a lot of what's been happening in our nation in the past year, it's more important than ever that we take the time to do that important work. So looking forward to the conversation this evening.
Thanks, Anthony. So we're going to go ahead and start just introducing some of our panelists. As always, I get the first shot to bringing in some panelists that I know and are dear to my heart. First of all, I'm going to bring in this young man who I'm so proud of, that I remember him back when I worked at PAL. He was a young man running around behind his mom, doing great things, taking over and following his father in his footsteps in many different aspects in the work field, and also taking on leaderships in the community. I'm going to introduce Kenneth Cohen and let him talk a little bit about himself. Go ahead, Kenny, and you can call me Scott tonight.
Good evening, Barbershop. How's everybody doing? Kenny Cohen, president of the NAACP Northeast Queens branch. And I'm very excited to be a part of this panel today, especially being from Flushing in the Northeast Queens area. There's a lot of interaction between the Asian community and the Black community. And I've had the fortune to collaborate with a lot of the Asian leadership in that section of the city. So I'm really just looking forward to some great discussion and like you said, spreading the love and figuring out ways that we can come together in solidarity, because the old civil rights saying is always on point. United we stand, divided we fall. So the more we find the differences between each other, the more we're going to continue to fall. So just happy to be on here with everybody tonight.
Thank you. And my next guest that I'm going to bring on is my mentor, my big brother, someone who I look up to, one who can tell me like it is. He holds no punches at times when we talk. He's always been supportive to me. I appreciate the work that he does with the YMCA. I want to turn over to my buddy, my friend, my mentor, Cedric Dew.
Scott, first of all, thank you, man, for asking me to be a part of this. This is a true labor of love, and as has been our relationship from day one. I remember meeting you many, many years ago. And to all the panelists, shout out to all my Asian brothers and sisters out there. I got to spend some time in the Flushing YMCA. And I always say, sometimes you get an education when you experience an environment where you walk in and you're the African-American in the room, the Black man in the room, and you don't know what to expect. And it was such an experience. But what I've learned most and foremost is that we are all in this together. We are all the same. As much as we are different, we are the same. And so thank you for allowing me to be a part of the panel.
All right, Mike, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. And I don't want to steal too much time away from introducing other people, but what Cedric said really resonated for me. I've been the only Black person in a room, but typically it's been because everybody else is white. So I just think that that's really a fascinating experience. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what that was like for you and what you learned from that. So yeah, it's my privilege to introduce a couple of other folks. If you've been watching us for a while, back in February when we did family and community and transformation, and we talked about Black history, I had one of our colleagues from the New York Police Department here, Alvin Foster. So we said, this is a great topic. We would love to have somebody from the NYPD, and we're pleased to have with us today one of his colleagues, and we look forward to hearing what he has to say. William Kwok, who is Asian liaison from Immigrant Outreach Unit, Community Outreach Division, NYPD. Welcome to the Barbershop, William.
Good evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. It's my honor to be part of this. This is definitely something that's interesting. That this is my first time here, so seeing all this, is definitely one of the most critical requirements to eliminating hate. As was said before, is having that understanding and having an environment to speak with each other. Definitely, helps further that goal. So it's absolutely critical. From us, just a little bit about where I'm from. We're the Immigrant Outreach Unit. And I'm part of the Community Affairs Bureau Community Outreach Division. And we go out to, meet with different immigrant communities that are newly immigrated to this wonderful city of ours. So one of my colleagues, her name is Detective Michelle. She covers the Caribbean community. My Sergeant Siddiqui, covers the Muslim and South Asian communities. And together, we go out there and we try to hit as many communities as we can and make them, to bridge that gap, because a lot of these folks come from areas where, their interactions with the police are very limited or non-existent at all. So, the whole purpose of this unit is to have them understand that we are here to help them. We are, there are some misunderstandings out there. There are certain, things that are out there that aren't the greatest, but we want to be able to let them know that we're here to help, and opportunities like this are great. And again, I definitely appreciate the opportunity to put that out there, and I'm looking forward to the discussions we're going to have as the night proceeds. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'll give you guys that ball back.
Thank you, Officer Kwok. So I guess I'll take the mic, Scott. We have some other guests here too, and I'll let you know when we were trying to figure out how do we try as broad and diverse as this heritage is to have representation kind of across the banner, across the the field, if you will. And so I'm really pleased that we're able to reach out to a couple of our sister agencies like the NYPD. Another one is the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And so another guest we were glad to welcome to the barbershop is Shaquan Womack for the racial justice. He's a racial justice and program specialist there. So Shaquan, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shaquan Womack, and I am the racial justice and program specialist. Ultimately, what I do is educate the community on the human rights law. And I also do a lot of stuff with restorative justice. So leading a lot of healing circles, especially during this time. I'm really happy to be here. A lot of the things I've been thinking about is how my history and my history of my people as a Black man is intertwined with the history of folks who identify as Asian and intertwined not just in a negative way, but also in a positive way, and thinking about the strength that we have together historically. So I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you. Is my mic on? I keep muting reflexively. Okay, my mic's on. Good. Next, it's my pleasure to welcome from the Arab American Family Support Center, Farah Salam. Hopefully I said your name correctly. Please correct me if I didn't. Did I get it right, Farah?
Almost. My name is Farah.
Farah, thank you.
You're almost close. Good evening, everyone. My name is Farah Salam, and I'm the priority area specialist for external engagement at the Arab American Family Support Center. And I'm really excited to be here today because, like how Shaquan and everyone else said, I think, growing up as a South Asian American, in this country, you have a lot of similar experiences with, your Black brothers and sisters, East Asian brothers and sisters, and any other community of color. So we have a lot of similarities, and we can celebrate the differences as well. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got two more guests. We have Sunny and we have Jean to introduce, but I'm actually going to defer to my colleague, Anthony. Anthony has been behind the scenes, not just making himself available, but really assisting us in the lift this evening. And so since our great colleagues from Moya and Manhattan College are here, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to introduce him to everyone.
We'll save Sonny for last, but we're very pleased that another one of our sister agencies, offices that we actually work closely with, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, that Jean Bay, who's the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs, is here to join us. So Jean, why don't you say a few words and let us know what's going on.
Thank you. Going before Sonny is kind of like, lackluster appetizer before like great entrees. So I kind of feel like I need to keep it short. But
we can't afford to gas him up any more than we already have. So
Jean, that's because Mike and I know Sonny, like we rib him all the time.
Yeah.
No.
Take as much time as you need.
But I was joking yesterday that I was super excited when I got this invitation because like I always wanted to snoop into Barbershop, which drove my husband crazy, and he's watching right now. So haha, I'm on the panel, he's not. But on a more serious note, not only as somebody who's working at Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and we had our own particularly, I mean, we have always sort of internally thought about whether we are truly addressing diversity of immigrants, respecting it, sort of thinking about how to better address it. But particularly lately, that's been over the last couple of years, that's been something that's very much been on our mind. And not only that, I'm a first generation immigrant, and as somebody who came here almost as an adult, basically as an adult, I just know that the first time that I truly felt like I was accepted by the society here was when, Black and Brown communities accepted me. And a lot of that as a, sort of partner and a friend. And a lot of that had to do with the understanding of the feeling of being minority and alienation. And so despite the differences that, we might have, and we can talk about race being just a construct, but at the same time, that, feeling of like that experience of being subject to racism and subject to marginalization, and that is something that we all share. And so on that note, I'm very looking forward to the discussion tonight, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So thank you again, Jean, for joining us. And last but definitely not least, we have Sunny Ago, who's joining us. And in addition to being a good friend of Mike and myself, Sunny has done a lot of work in higher education. He's taught Asian American studies. He's been involved in efforts to foster multicultural curricula and efforts on different college campuses in the Northeast. And he's currently the Associate Vice President, right, Sunny? Associate Vice President at Manhattan College. In many ways, Sunny is on the panel tonight as kind of our resident expert when it comes to Asian American studies and the history of Asian American communities and their achievements, and also how systemic racism has affected our community too. So, Sunny, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony. And no amount of tip money in my pocket could probably keep Mike and Anthony from telling some stories tonight. So I'll catch you guys later. But no, I truly appreciate the opportunity, Mike and Anthony, for being part of this. As I mentioned to Mike over the course of the past few months, I'm a huge fan of Barbershop, and Scott is like my new favorite MC of of early night TV, I should say, right? So I think it's really important to think about this particular month in sort of a broader theme of fostering dialogue and conversation across perceived backgrounds, right? So we have people who, and I agree with Jean, I mean, race is a construct, but in reality, on the ground, people see race, right? So making sure that we have opportunities to have these types of conversations really is really telling, not only in terms of building coalitions, as Anthony will probably touch on a little bit later, as many of our speakers will, but also in terms of learning about one another. I think at the most fundamental level, we need to know what we're about as human beings in order to create some sort of opportunities for change and connection. So the work I've done in higher ed is really one where, yes, I did start teaching as an Asian American studies lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. That was quite some time ago. So my training is academic, but at the same time, I've been in student affairs for probably about 20 years. And the work I really, really do on the day-to-day, operationally, programmatically, is really policy work to figure out ways to develop strategies to provide access for underrepresented students of color to higher education, as well as once around campus to create opportunities for dialogue so that learning takes place both inside and outside of the classroom. It's all a part of really educating students from a holistic perspective. So the areas that I do supervise at Manhattan College are the Multicultural Center, the Women and Gender Resource Center, our Commuter Student Office, which is really primarily dedicated to FGLI, first generation low income students. And as you can imagine, and Manhattan College is located in the Bronx. Those are primarily underrepresented students of color. So all this type of work is really providing direct support for these populations. But more important than that, in my book, is to create opportunities for dialogue across these, what I said earlier, perceived boundaries. It's important that we model that behavior. And it's important that we model that behavior and teach students, the next generation, to have opportunities, number one, to have these conversations, and actually to show them how to have these conversations. So I'm so thrilled tonight to be part of this panel, because I believe we're on the cusp of this conversation right now. So I don't want to delay it too much. But thank you so much again for this opportunity. It's sort of like I'm walking on the floor of Madison Square Garden. I've been in the bleachers watching the barbershop. Now I get to play.
That's an awesome round of introductions. An awesome segue back to you, Scott. So if Sonny's ready to play and everybody's ready to play, blow the whistle. Let's go.
Well, Fernando told me to tell you hi first, so he's on. So
Okay.
Fernando's he's in the crowd.
Yeah,
I got enough trouble with Mike and Anthony.
So I got him, Fernando. They know. Okay.
I'm glad to see our audience is ever expanding. So hello, Fernando.
So let's just like we said, let's just dive in. There's such rich history that has happened in the Asian Pacific Islands and Heritage Month. I want to make sure I get it right. How far? Well, let me get, because Sonny, you're definitely what you sent me with the historical line. Can we at least go back and let's start with some of the historical knowledge you have, and then I want to go to Cedric and Kenny and talk to you two about how working that relationship in the Asian community. How did you all navigate that? But I think we have to start with some of the history. And I got to go back to Sonny because he sent us a goo gob of historical stuff to read. And it was like, whoa, it's so much. And you start reading and reading. Then I figured I had to do some other work. So I had to stop. But I didn't get all the way through it, Sonny. But can you just start back?
I think from what Sonny sent, it seems like the Asian American Pacific Islander community has had a very complicated, shall we say, history. So
Yes.
why don't you walk us through some of that and why it's such a complicated history?
Oh, absolutely, Mike. And I'm calling on Anthony to interject when he feels like he needs to. He's equally as expert in this, and he's being modest if he says no or shakes his head at this point. But I've learned a lot from him over the years as well. And I imagine Gene as well and Farah as well have a sense of their own communities and the historical perspective that they can provide, not just from their own personal lives, but I mean, it's interesting how we learn from our families just as much as we learn from a book, right? So I would welcome that part of the conversation as well. So I mean, I think that the Asian American, well, let's rephrase it. Asian American Pacific Islander, there's a new catchphrase, right? It's AAPI. So it's Asian Pacific Islander Desi American community. Is one that is complicated in as much as we must ask ourselves, are we truly a community, right? So there is a Chinese American community, there is a Filipino American community, there is a Pakistani American community, there's a Korean American community, there is, a Japanese American community. However, what links us all together, certainly as it relates to being communities in the United States, an overall umbrella group, is a shared history, in some ways, sadly, of exclusion in America, right? So we're immigrants. Maybe not myself, maybe not the panelists who were born here, but certainly our families somewhere down the line immigrated to the United States. And as part of that process, the immigration process, it is one where they not only did they immigrate to the country to look for better opportunities, but once they saw those opportunities available to them, they found barriers to getting to those opportunities. So I think that's what, at the basic level, we share in common as an AAPI community. I think that's important to understand. Just historically, and Scott, I apologize, I can't go through each each milestone because it'll be like a 4-hour barbershop. And while I would love that, all of you are going to start tuning out at one point or another. But I think what people need to understand is, as it relates to Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander, AAPI, immigration to the United States, there are really three milestones that mark the history that people actually learn about in schools. So it's the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Again, it's a policy of exclusion. Japanese internment in the 1940s, during the 1940s, and then most recently is the quote unquote Muslim ban after 9/11, right? So how people kind of view the Muslim community as it relates to being a threat to the United States. Regardless of those three milestones in our history of exclusion, our history of discrimination, there have actually been 34 legislative acts between the 1850s and the year 2000 that has actually excluded a community within the Asian Pacific Islander umbrella. And you know, it's one where I believe David, our support, is going to post the timeline of that. So please take a look at those. There are 34 legislative acts within a 150-year time period, which is a little frightening, right? So while we're here as immigrants to this country, every time we step off the plane or the boat, we encounter a barrier to our success, but we still believe in the American dream. So I would also say that despite the fact that we have this shared history of immigration, immigrating to this country for opportunity, we've also had a shared struggle of realizing at one point or another, it wasn't a clear path for us towards success. So I think that's what we share. To answer your question in terms of complication, Mike, why it's such a complicated relationship, not just within our own communities, but our relationship with the United States in general. So some of the milestones that I think need to really look at is, you know, people think that Asians first started immigrating to this country as a result of the gold rush in the 1850s. Chinese Americans saw opportunity on the West Coast to get gold. But shortly thereafter, in 1858, for instance, there was a law to ban Chinese Americans. So I mean, it's sort of like we saw this opportunity, then within a couple of years, you can't do it anymore. But people actually don't realize that Asians have been immigrating to the United States as early as the late 1500s. In Morro Bay, California, there was a Filipino community that immigrated here. And then in the 1700s, escaping Spanish persecution, Filipinos actually settled in Louisiana. So those are the earliest documented Asian Americans to immigrate to the United States. 1850 marked a huge turning point in terms of Chinese immigrating to this country. As early as 1870, New York City's Chinatown started to reemerge. And now that's really important because it's kind of hand in hand with our city of New York City as being a diverse and welcoming space. Albeit that was sort of a segregated space, but it was a community that was slowly but surely started to emerge and take a presence in what is New York City, which we claim as the most diverse city in the world. So the contributions of the Chinese American community to New York City alone cannot be overlooked historically. They built downtown. Well, they also built the railways, but they built downtown essentially. So as we go throughout history, you see this development in terms of the contributions of Asian Americans to the structures and the organizations and the actual construction of this country. And we can go down the list. There are so many things to pull from. But I think what's really important in recent years is to really understand the accomplishments of Asian Americans and this is one of those things where let's play some trivia. Asian Americans who have actually contributed most recently to the things that we're talking about now, in terms of success and in terms of success in the fields of STEM, in terms of the success in terms of the civil rights movement. So as early as the 1940s, there was a Chinese American, Chen Xiongwu, who actually really helped with developing atomic energy. And I don't think people realize, you know, atomic energy is a huge thing in terms of not only weapons, but in terms of providing energy and resources to billions of people. Mm-hmm. During the civil rights movement, and I think Anthony could speak more to this than I can, Yuri Kochiyama worked very closely with Malcolm X. She was an activist, I believe from the West Coast, that transplanted herself here in New York City to work primarily with Malcolm X. And she was actually with him on the day that he was assassinated. So keep in mind, there have been coalitions along the way. In terms of academia, right now, I think a lot of the agencies that you're working with, Mike and Scott and Anthony, we are really addressing issues of microaggression and cultural competence. There are two brothers, Daryl and Stanley Sue, who are at Teachers College here in Columbia. They actually founded in the 1970s the microaggression theory. And they were actually talking about underrepresented people of color. They're Asian Americans that actually were talking about Black and brown folk. So they pushed that research to the point where we're actually talking about on the day-to-day now in terms of professional development, in terms of creating opportunities for dialogue, and the cultural competence. How do we work with one another and be responsive to our needs when we're from different backgrounds and perspectives? They developed that theory also. And then you have stuff in the STEM fields like, Ajay Bhatt, 1990s, USB, everybody uses USB. YouTube, founded by Stephen Chen. And then most recently, and I think this is important in terms of activism, and I had the privilege of actually meeting and working with this young lady a couple of years ago at a conference. Her name is Amanda Nguyen. She actually was integral in passing the 2013 Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act. She's Vietnamese American from Mike's alma mater, from Harvard, and she was integral in making that law. And one of the major parts of that is if you are sexually assaulted, a rape kit must be performed, right? So you think that's not a big thing, but it's actually huge in terms of sexual assault awareness and rights. So these are some of the things that the Asian American community have contributed to. It's not just math and science. It's not just, I hate to put it out there. It's not just like entertainment. But they've contributed to the fields, obviously, of math and science and entertainment. But in terms of academia and in terms of activism, they're present. And I think that because there has been this overarching idea that we are sort of a model or silent minority, we don't actually hear about these accomplishments that much. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation so we can talk a little bit more about that.
That's amazing. So when you do the 4-hour seminar, sign me up because I'll just get some popcorn and keep listening. But among the things that you did, you covered a lot of history in actually a very condensed portion of time. But a couple of things that stood out for me is you mentioned YouTube almost casually, and the fact that everyone that's listening right now is interacting with us through YouTube. We've been doing this monthly. We started with Facebook Live. We've been doing YouTube for several months now. Like, these contributions cannot be minimized or ignored. And as when you mentioned, what was the name of the colleague of Malcolm X's? Could you say that person's name again?
Yuri Kochiyama.
Yuri Kochiyama. It reminded me, and the name escapes me right now, but back during Black History Month, I was reading up on the Black Panthers. Wasn't there a Yellow Tigers movement that worked kind of hand in glove in California with the Black Panthers as well?
And I believe Anthony knows history. Yes, I believe Anthony knows the history a little bit. I think Yuri Kochiyama is part of that. So I would imagine that there was
just amazing stuff that
Sonny,
I didn't know about until earlier this year.
You give me too much credit, Sonny. I don't know all of this history.
But you know what? I don't think any of us know all of any of our own histories. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've gotten to a lot of trouble, and mostly at my mother's urging, just to learn a few generations of my own family history. You know what I mean? If you go back past 1780 something when the Huguenots decided, let's give some Black people a shake and sell them some land in South Carolina, like, that's where part of my story begins. If I hadn't have had other people like, you need to pay attention to that, I wouldn't know that story. So we have to give ourselves credit and give our listeners and our attendees credit for hanging in there and listening and learning something new. So but you dropped a lot right there. And Anthony, don't be humble, don't be shy. We're going to talk about this model minority stuff in a minute, but I think other panelists may want to jump in, maybe just react to what Sunny has said so far. I kind of set the stage as we pivot.
This is something actually Anthony mentioned yesterday. I'm totally about to steal, but obviously part of the hand in hand of what Sonny was talking about, I also want to, make sure that that's also highlighted, is also how much, AAPI community also has benefited from the, civil rights movement and basically, a lot of these activism that has been led by Black communities. And so, in fact, Voting Rights Act and then Immigration and Nationality Act being, part of the key legislation. So I just wanted to highlight that. But yeah, of course.
Yeah, just to pick up on that a little bit. And, I think we at DYCD had our own internal AAPI heritage event this morning. And one of the things I led off with was just the term Asian American, which is a pretty common term right now as it's, used with the AAPI umbrella, but that wasn't always the case. And there was really two graduate students at UC Berkeley in 1968 who came up with the term. And I just learned their names today, Emma G and Yuji Ichioka, Chinese American, Japanese American. I think they were a couple too, but they saw an opportunity to create the term because they were inspired by the civil rights movement themselves, by the Black Power movement. They and other students were protesting against the Vietnam War. And they wanted to figure out a way to kind of bring together some of the Asian students on campus, which at the time was mostly Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese. And they coined the term Asian Americans for Political Alliance. So most folks credit them with the ones starting that term. So while it's a common term now, it wasn't always the case. And I think it also speaks to, and this is an ongoing effort within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, just how the Asian Pacific American and Pacific Islander community itself celebrates diversity within its own community and how there's Pan-Asian solidarity. Because, we've come a ways, I would say definitely the past 20 years. I would say also definitely post 9/11. I know that, post 9/11, when, some of our South Asian and Muslim and Sikh brothers were being scapegoated post 9/11, it forced this conversation within the Asian American community. How do we stand together, right? And I remember at the time, it was the Japanese American community because they had faced internment in the World War II. They were one of the first members of the Asian American community to come out and say, hey, we need to stand with our South Asian Muslim and Sikh brothers and sisters, right, while they're going through this. So, but this is all to say that, it's Asian American, it's a term that is continually being worked on. But what I am very proud about is that I feel like having been part of this community and knowing people in this community, we've tried to do that work. Now it's not complete, but I would say that there's a healthy effort always to try to be inclusive and Pan-Asian and stand up for each other. And I think that's something that we can bring to the rest of the world. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could keep going on, but let me stop there. So.
Yeah, and I just want to say, again, and I'm glad we're having a little bit of a history context because I was reflecting on this conversation, and I was a child of the 70s, and there was a mixture, and this beautiful mixture between Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and then came the martial arts movement. And people don't realize that combination really created a stronger inner city urban youth. I truly believe it was the key ingredients that combined to create the whole hip hop movement, because you had a sense of self-awareness, which I always tell people the most important word in hip hop is the word I, which really evolves from the inner self, which stems from the martial arts movement, because I never forget walking out of that first martial arts movement, seeing Five Fingers of Death, which is the first one I ever saw out of the Bronx Theater, in the Bronx, and coming out and having this sense of, I want to be like that. I want to be able to fight like that. I want to be able to fight with discipline. And I think that transcended into the civil rights movement as it evolved into the 70s. And I always say that we adopted the Asian community as our brothers and sisters in that struggle, because you brought things that at that time we didn't have, which was a sense of emotional discipline. We were angry. Anger was the flavor of the day. And when we saw that calm, I know I got into martial arts. I studied martial arts for almost 25 years, and so many of my friends did. And I think that that ingredient, it really, really created a different type of African American in inner city urban areas.
Yeah, and I just quickly wanted to jump in. So, I'm really glad that, we're talking about the complicated history of Asian Americans in the United States. And I'm really glad that Sunny brought up the Muslim ban, because I think oftentimes whenever we think of Asian, we always forget that a lot of the Asian community are South Asians, Central Asians, and may identify as Muslim. Because I remember, I grew up in a very post 9/11 world, and I remember like what I experienced and what other people who look like me and practice my religion experience. And, it's all related to the fact that, we were seen as other, right? And I think the support that the Muslim community got from the Black community and the Brown community and Latinx community and the Asian and Japanese, Chinese American communities and other communities, that has helped build relationships and create solidarity and allyship with one another. And we're seeing that now too, with everything that's happened over the past year. You have everybody support, you have the Black community supporting the Asian community, you have the Brown community supporting the Asian community, and vice versa last year, when we saw that Black Lives Matter movement, and this year with Stop Asian Hate, and even more. So, just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate the fact that Sunny brought up the Muslim ban, because I think also at that time we saw a lot of people come together and stand up for the Muslim community back in 2017, and not just the Muslim community, but immigrants from, countries that were thought of to be terrorist countries or Muslim countries just because they were Muslim majority countries. So, it's definitely a relationship between how the international has, like what's happening overseas has the effect over how it affects here in the United States and the communities from those countries as well.
You referenced Sunny, and toward the close of what Sunny was saying before, he used the term model minority. Sunny, what were you talking about, and can we as a group unpack what does that mean? What is the model minority?
So like I don't do this at work every single day, but I can't keep my mic on for some reason. So I mean, the model minority is a myth. Historically, there have been three toxic myths that have been attributed to the Asian American community. The first is yellow peril. The fear that East Asians are taking over the world. That was predominantly prevalent during World War II, actually, even probably a little bit before then. But it's a fear that Asians had no regard for acculturation, assimilation, and that they were going to actually conquer and take over the world. So I think we were discussing this earlier in our prep meeting. Those who control these myths are the ones who control the media and control the messaging in this country. So one of the first toxic myths about Asian Americans was that yellow peril. There's another toxic myth known as perpetual foreigners, right? So that's on the everyday. So a lot of Asian Americans are seen as never really quite belonging to this country, despite the fact that many Asian Americans are born in this country, that because they look a certain way or they eat a certain food or they practice a certain cultural traditions, express themselves in different cultural ways, that there are always foreigners in this country, that they haven't quite fully been part of the quote unquote American society. So the perpetual foreigner toxic myth always separates Asians from the broader white community. And then Mike actually said the model minority myth. So the model minority myth actually emerged in the 1970s and 80s. And I think the model minority myth you can go on and on about the model minority myth, but the model minority myth, in my opinion, and many scholars' opinions, is that it was a myth that actually reinforced the notion that communities of color, underserved, underprivileged communities, could actually pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So policies were developed, in particular admissions policies to elite institutions of higher education were instituted that said that really looked at Asian Americans as a success story in relation to other underprivileged, underserved, and underrepresented communities of color, and said that we do not need affirmative action to provide access. We have a model minority that is able to achieve and attain at higher rates, educational rates, than even white communities. So it's actually a myth that is rooted in research that is really unfounded in many ways. It's research that takes a group of Asian Americans and looks at them, and it completely excludes Southeast Asians. At the time, it really excluded part of the South Asian community even. But they're really focusing on the high achievements of Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Korean Americans at elite Ivy League or select liberal arts institutions, and saying that, no, this community can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We don't need affirmative action. There is no bias in testing. There's no bias in the admissions process. So that's what the model minority myth is. The problem with that is it actually reinforces systemic racism and barriers for communities of color to gain access to institutions of higher learning because of the bias in testing, because of the bias in admissions practices. So now as the debate continues as to, and I think we're at the point now where they're actually saying that we are overrepresented in terms of Asian Americans in elite institutions, they're actually changing the admissions policies and practices to get in. So now the select few who have Asian Americans who have actually mastered the admissions process are actually they're not being accepted at the same rates as white students with equal credentials. So there is a little bit of backlash on that.
So Sonny, I just have a question, and this is really for anybody. Who's setting the bar? Who is setting these standards? You know, if anybody can answer, I just want to know who is setting these standards that have brainwashed us to believe all this stuff.
Well, it's those who have the power to provide access, right? So access to colleges and universities. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. Well, let's put it this way. And I can just only speak to the colleges and college campuses that I've worked on. We look at what a student body should look like before we start our admissions process, our recruitment enrollment process. And that doesn't mean we look at it in terms of race, but we look at it in terms of experience. So there's a certain cultural nuance to creating a campus culture or traditions that particular institutions want to sustain and reproduce from year to year. I mean, when you talk about, for instance, Brown University, or I don't want to say the publics because the publics are publics, but the private institutions in particular. If you talk about a certain type of institution, you will know what type of student goes there, because they fall into this category of they contribute to this overall campus culture that is replicated and reproduced from year to year. So I would say that those who provide the access, the admissions officers, the admissions teams, going all the way up to the board of trustees of some colleges and universities, they actually set the tone. But then it's even a broader, Scott, it's even a broader issue. Because if you gain access to a particular college or university in this country, you get the cultural capital once you graduated from that particular institution to get access to the best jobs in this country. So your name is attached to a certain degree, or a college's name is attached to your name, and then that's your cachet to get into the best jobs in this country. So I don't want to say it's a conspiracy theory by any means, but it's all interconnected.
So Shaquan or Kenny, because I want to hear the young guy's perspective on this, and Farah, you're a youngin' also, so I got you. But I still don't understand, and I really want somebody to dig in with me. Who is setting these narratives? Who's coming out and saying, because we all talk about we're all immigrants. We're all immigrants. There was only a native people that were here. Everybody else came here on a boat. Okay.
Or was brought here.
We were all brought here. Okay. So who is setting this narrative? The only people I know who were here on this part of the world prior to all the boat rides that came over were the Native Americans. and they're ostracized almost just as bad as everybody else. So who is saying this narrative? Kenny or Shaquan? Help me out.
Listening to Sonny, it's very interesting listening to him, because I'm pretty sure the people that are in the room making those decisions don't look like anyone who was on this panel today. And I think that happens too often when there's not enough representation, enough diverse representation. Decisions are made on behalf of people, and they don't even know what the needs of those people are that they're making the decisions on behalf of. So what ends up happening is the trickle down, where now the Black community is upset with the Asian community because they're receiving these advancements and these opportunities that we may not have had the opportunity to get. But it's not even the Asian community's fault. It's other people that are making these decisions on all of our behalf. And it's Mike said something that was very interesting earlier about knowing our own history. And with the ability now to start learning about history that's not white, we're learning more about different things in Black culture and Black history. We're learning different things about Asian culture and Asian history, and we're starting to see that, one, the representation is important, and two, once again, like we're probably going to continue to say all night, we have more similarities, especially with our history in this country, than we have differences. And I think that's part of the fear factor too. It's like they don't want us to.
Wait. Who is they? Who is they?
I don't know who they is. I'm gonna say just the powers that be, the institution, because anytime you have groups of minorities coming together, something happens to start trying to break us apart and remind.
But we're all part of the machine. So
I'm gonna say one thing, or two things. One is we could do an entire barbershop focused on quote they unquote. You know what I mean? Like we really could, right? But that's the first thing. But the second thing is I'm just going to use this as a vehicle. I've been doing some reading about matching bias. And I've thought of it keying off of what Sunny said right now and with what a moment ago. And part of what Sunny said would make sense to me because since you work in academic settings, you can easily look at academia as a frame of reference. But what you're saying, I imagine parallels in other sectors and other industries. People, individuals, however they get there, as they attain some access and some measure of control in whatever it is that they're doing, human behavior has this peculiar stuff where you start looking at some of it's unconscious, although unfortunately a lot of it is conscious too, but at least look at the unconscious part of it. You start looking at people who seem to think like you, maybe even dress like you, act like you. And when you're hiring or you're looking to do a contract with somebody, you start thinking about people who seem like they're going to be sympathetic or understanding of where you're coming from. And lo and behold, certain things take root, start reinforcing themselves, start becoming prevalent. And without discernment, that's just the way it is. I'm not biased against other people. We are just all vacation the same kind of places. That's where people vacation. I'm not biased against other people. We just tend to think certain things. So if I'm looking to interact with a new person, and my pool is the people who look like me, talk like me, dress like me, think like me, behave and act where I behave, and now you're talking about, why don't you introduce somebody different? Well, I'd love to, but I need to get X done. So and I don't want to take us there and drop us off a cliff, but I think that's one of the places where we have to look, and one of the places where I have looked. Some of the work here at DYCD at the agency, but other, like I was head of diversity for another organization years ago, and the way that we talked about it then is, in order to get to the best decisions, you got to have some people who have different ways of looking at the issues. And then you talk openly about the issues to get to the best decision. So whether it's academia or X or Y, I think we got to confront some of this matching bias, for lack of a better descriptor. People go with what seems the easiest, the most familiar, the least threatening to them. And also, and now I will stop and leave that to the other groups, right? When you do that sort of thing, you as the individual with your little bit of power, your bit of access, you're least likely to be threatened that you're going to lose it. Because there's other people who kind of you relate to, you're cool with or whatever. So not that you would lose it, but you're maybe the least threatened.
Yeah, I
I
want to
wanna,
jump into what if I can real quick, I want to jump into what Mike said. And it's really the last thing when losing that little bit of what you may have with someone coming on board. And in this space, I think especially with Black and Brown communities, there's been a level of survivalship, if I had to make a word, that causes a level of insulationism, right? So it's like, man, I'm just trying to make it. I got my own problems. How do I get this thing to work? And so actually I want to pivot this to Shaquan, if I said your name right. What does allyship really look like across all communities, especially as it relates with our Asian family, right? And I say that across the board because I love what Sunny said earlier. Like the AAPI community, this was bigger than math and science, right? Like I grew up where before there was Jabberwockies, I had my own Asian brothers and sisters doing hip hop dance with me, right? Before Yao Ming and Jeremy Lin like lit the basketball on fire, I would go to Flushing Park and get my behind handed to me. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm gonna go back real quick and say I remember one of the first movies that really got me into jujitsu and all types of karate was Bruce Leroy. Like I wanted to be that guy, right? And I say all that to say it was always embedded, even in film, right? You see this large flux of great film from the AAPI community, from Parasite the year before to now, No Man Land, which just got an Oscar. There's this really big surge that we are celebrating that I think is beautiful, and I want us to figure out what are the different ways we can be allies to this. I don't even want to call it a movement because it's always been there. We just didn't give the acknowledgement that it deserved. So how do we be allies to this new great space that we're in? Because we've been the protesting together. This was happening before George Floyd. Now it's just showing itself in the light. So how do we keep that light brimming?
Shaquan,
Yeah,
you want to highlight
thank
that?
you. Yeah, thank you. I think one of the biggest things is being a bystander intervention. So when we see things on the street and we see things, whether it be in the street, whether it be in the workplace, whether it be anywhere, we need to intervene when these things, as you know, whether it be microaggressions or violence, right? One incident I can think of is Vilma Kari, a 25-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in Hell's Kitchen, and people watched this woman be brutally attacked, right? So in those instances, we can't, whether it be intervening in the moment or bringing awareness to these things that are happening. That I think for me, that's what the biggest thing in terms of bystander intervention that needs to happen. Also, we also need to not play into the media's divisiveness. A lot of times the media will say things like, well, what do Black people need to do? Or try to play into our, some of the history in which there was that divisiveness, but also won't highlight the history in which we were together. For instance, Fred Hampton, right? A person who got many marginalized communities together and which put fear into the powers that be. And that's why he was killed, because we got together and really tried to fight the powers that be. So I think not playing into the media's divisiveness and understanding the strength that we have together as a community.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that too. I think that the other part of it is understanding that revolution and struggle are a very important common denominator. We would bring interns into the Y from China, and I would sit with those young people and listen to them talk about the revolution that was going on back in China. The things we take for granted, they're fighting for today. They're fighting for the right to have a voice in their country under a dictatorship. They're fighting for the right to be able to control their own economics. They're fighting for similar things that we fought for. The other thing that came to mind is that we also have something else in common. We've both been slaves in one form or another. Oftentimes indentured servitude is a fancy word for slavery. And oftentimes people forget that in this country, Blacks were not the only slaves. We were the first, we're the most documented slave of this country, but Asians have experienced slavery in this country as well. And I think that when we understand that we share similar struggle and that both of us are, it's part of the soul of who we are. And oftentimes we're in the same room together, and there's almost a non-verbal connection in that struggle in our history, whether we are first generation, second generation, third generation, as many of us are. I think that's the common denominator. I think the thing I learned working in Flushing was that, when you listen, you stop talking, thinking and just listen, you gain so much knowledge, because people wait to see if you will stop to listen. And that's what I found, when I worked with the Asian community, was that they really wanted to know if I was going to listen. They would let me talk forever. All right. But the more important thing was the moment when you stop and you listen, and then you find out all the things you really need to know. So I think that's where our unifying values are.
And Jean, how did that play out as women through the struggle?
Sorry, in terms of how, well, I mean, I think as a woman, it's another, I think it again sort of goes both ways. I think, in fact, that's a very good question. Like feminism wise, there's been, it went through multiple waves and sort of trying to think about what does it mean for a woman to be a feminist, right? And like who sets in fact, we were talking about the they, like who sets the framework as to, what it means to be a feminist, what is the, what are we trying to achieve? And, especially like in the sort of later stage, there has been a lot of discussion about, is it, are we really thinking about the intersection between, sort of gender equity, like when we talk about feminism, and then the race issues, right? When we talk about like, these are the feminist priorities, are we thinking about what, especially for instance, Black women, or let's even talk about Black trans women's, like struggles and their needs and their priorities? Like, are we really thinking about that? Like, are we thinking about issues that are specific to Asian women as what we are experiencing versus, white women and, Hispanic women's, et cetera? I think there has been a lot more discussion around that, but also, again, sort of getting back to what, everyone was talking about here so far, like, what we have in common. And this is something, actually someone once said to me that I keep thinking about is, you run into a woman who's like super annoying and you really, don't like her, but in your heart that that woman, no matter how much you disagree with her and you don't seem to have anything in common with her, that that woman has experience of basically being, ignored, marginalized because they were women. This is probably even the case for, I'm going to be controversial on this, like Ivanka Trump, or, like whoever it is, like, I'm sure it happened to her. And not that, that's the kind of solidarity that I'm exactly seeking, but the idea is, there is something there that we all, experience together, and understanding that there's common experience, that, we can connect with each other as human beings, that there's an understanding that can be sought. And so I think, that goes beyond just like race, but also like, gender and sexuality and other issues. And I think that's sort of, some of the, I think sort of, even when I think about racial justice, in fact, some of the things that, I think about is like, for instance, you think about LGBTQ issues, right? And there's still so much work to be done, but like part of, I think what they have been really good at in terms of making it a mainstream issue and, get into sort of the dialogue is sort of making them as, well, these are literally your brothers and sisters, and someone, and they are part of your life. They're not the separate people with like completely different way of thinking and desire, etc., that you can't understand. Like, they are just like you. And I think that's something that, again, like, we want to seek through forms like this, and we want to have a broader understanding of, while also celebrating the diversity and understanding that we each have our own unique issues.
Gene, I love what you said, and I was amused, but also totally down with you using Ivanka Trump as an example, even if it's just as an aside. And Scott, stay on mute for a second. Let me make my point, right? I have been talking with theoretically unlikely allies about allyship. So I love that we've been having this conversation framed around allyship. So I have a couple of friends who are varying degrees of conservative, and Sonny knows about this because I've shared some of the anecdotes. But I can't believe my friend said so. But we've agreed to have respectful dialogue, even though we rarely see eye to eye. And one of the things that we've talked about is how unhelpful it is to reinforce stereotypes. So to say that millions of people are deplorables, or millions of people are this, or millions of people are that, when what's most important is within your own sphere. If I'm able to engage with whoever it is, individual, and bust some myths and stereotypes, we perhaps can find some areas, even if they're minor, some areas of common ground. And I wanted to say that, and I also want to try to swing it back to Officer Kwok, because I'm thinking, when you walk through the community and your colleagues walk through the community, you wear the badge, you wear the uniform, and so there may be stereotypes or ways that people may perceive you. But you made it very clear at the outset, you are coming into the community as an ally. It's your assigned role within your institution. How do you try to bust that up and actually get into dialogue in the community when you travel? How do you demonstrate that you are an ally to your community?
Well, I mean, with the AAPI community, a lot of times language. As new immigrants, one of the key things that you see very frequently is that they don't speak English right off the bat. A lot of them do speak separate languages, and language in its own sort of format is one of the easiest ways to establish almost a common ground right off the bat. You see that very often with a lot of different communities, whether it be my community with the Asian community. Myself being Chinese, I speak both Mandarin and Cantonese, but my colleague who speaks Haitian Creole, when she goes into her community, when we first walk into a store, the store owner may look at us a little bit, hesitant. But the moment, she breaks down, she starts speaking in that Haitian Creole, all of a sudden, boom, they open right up. And it's the same thing even for myself, and same thing for my sergeant. As I said before, he speaks Bengali. So again, sometimes when we walk into a store, we're wearing our uniform, they see us and their first thought is, oh, well, why are the police here? And as soon as he starts speaking Bengali, as soon as I start speaking Chinese, boom, it changes the entire situation. So that's one of the biggest things right off the bat. But going back a little bit, when you talk about the stereotype, when we go into different communities, there is that stereotype that well, what are they doing here? Why are you here? It's not even, look, we're police officers. We're everywhere. We want to be there to make you feel safe. We want to be there to provide a service, to sometimes answer questions, and that hesitancy is tremendous. It speaks volumes about, what they perceive the uniform or the badge to be. Because as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this barbershop, a lot of times, the Asian community comes from their own country where policing isn't the same as it is here. There's a certain degree of unfairness, is a tremendous degree of and need help. It creates that barrier. It creates that, again, it creates that stereotype that I can't approach the police because maybe it's I don't know what could happen if I do approach the police because that's what I'm used to. I did want to bring up one quick thing. I know, Scott, you were asking before. I know we were jumping a little bit on that idea. I want to jump in on that. You were asking, who is they? Who is the people? I think that something with that is that it's gone on for so long that you can no longer trace it back to one individual or one particular person. This is something that's been, stereotypes have been perpetuated for so long throughout history of this country and all countries, that you can no longer kind of trace it back to one source. Where did this come from anymore? That whoever that initial point is would no longer be here anymore. We're now at the age where whether it be through social media perpetuating a stereotype or just people in general perpetuating a stereotype, you can't really connect and determine who's they anymore, because they is literally, all the people who haven't really been educated into what the truth is, or what's, we go on Twitter and someone makes a comment, a fact, what you think is a fact, you read it, and instead of reading or educating yourself and finding out what the truth is, you just take it at face value. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that today, which perpetuates a lot of these stereotypes, which perpetuates a lot of these bad and toxic stereotypes that harm all communities, whether they be AAPI communities, Black communities, or brown communities. We all have stereotypes that aren't true, that don't depict us in an accurate sort of way, whether even if you're a police officer, those stereotypes they're not helpful and they're not beneficial. And that's something that I think we really do need to tackle to further, to further work on this, eliminating this hate. We need to educate ourselves. We need to be a little bit, go beyond than just reading, the big words on like a newspaper or anything like that.
That's great, Officer Kwok. And if you've been following the barbershops for a while, when we've had some of our conversations about transformation, I don't remember who said it, but at least a few people a few times are talking about how you really have to assess the information that you're getting, where you're getting it from, and if you can trust the source of that information. So, I mean, you just hit the nail right there on the head. Part of it is how invested do we want to stay in a they that we can't even identify who that they is anymore. Maybe we need to actively be rewriting these narratives and reinforcing them in their community. I see Jerry's with me. Jerry's with the choir on this one, right?
100%. I think it's just diving in. I love what Officer Walk said when it really comes down to they being just the power of ignorance and how you fight ignorance just by getting more educated, being more aware. Anthony, again, you put on like an amazing presentation of just the history, and it showed me some, even with the allyship that I saw with Frederick Douglass. Like I didn't know that, and the more you see that, the more going back to I've been hearing this common theme, the more we realize how much stuff we really have in common, how many times we've been doing this struggle together and you weren't alone in this boat, like we were really hand in hand, the more powerful we can become. So I'm 100% in agreement with that. And the best way to fight ignorance is to educate yourself and educate others so they could be more aware of exactly what this really looks like, and even take allyship to another level, but really be a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a familyhood, to really put all of us in a position of power to make those governmental change, policy changes from the state and local, federal levels.
I want us to get into allyship, but I want to ask a quick question, partly because I just don't want to forget to ask the question. Earlier this week, we focused on trauma, and we did a lot of discussion, very, very open, forthright discussion about vulnerability and moving through trauma and kind of building up your team, and also letting people know I got to get you ready when I do my truth telling about the trauma that I've been experiencing, because I can't let you get overwhelmed, and then I don't even have you as a resource anymore when I let you know about my trauma. Because of this complicated history and so many different things we've already discussed over the past an hour, is it the case there are special strands because of historical racism, discrimination, the stories being underrepresented and erased from history? Are there particular trauma that members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community have been living through? If that's the case, what do we need to do to discuss that? What do we need to do to try to bring some healing toward that? And then let's circle back to allyship. Like, how can allies continue to support members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community with the trauma that they have been experiencing?
So I'll jump in on this, Mike, and I definitely want us to get back to the allyship and solidarity discussion. But I know something for myself that I've been thinking about, and I think it really, seeing is really right after the murders of the women in Atlanta, and then just reflecting on how, wow, all of a sudden now everyone's paying attention to the acts of anti-Asian bias and violence that have been happening in the past year. It took me a little while just to process all that was going on with me. And I think one of the things that came up for me a lot, and I think it's related to your question about trauma, is I know for myself as an Asian American, I would say some of the trauma I maybe have felt is that trauma of feeling erased or invisible or just not part of the conversation or not mattering, or only being the only one in the room. And there have been times when I've been the only one in the room. And just, the work that you have to do sometimes, like when you're the only one in the room, and to speak out and to fit in, and just to navigate all the different relationships and beings and people there, and just, just thinking about that. And I think that does weigh on you. It does weigh on you. And I think, that was a thing over the past few weeks, and I've been reflecting on all the incidents that have been happening, and just all the sudden attention that, so much of what been hurting about this moment is just, people not knowing enough, making assumptions about our community, not including us in the conversation, erasing our histories, or being made to feel invisible, even sometimes making your own self feel invisible, right? Just to maybe fit in, or just to accommodate. And there's a lot there. There's a lot there. I feel like I'm only just touching the tip of the iceberg here on that.
You hit me with that though, because I can relate to the idea that when you are the only one in the room, there's that race man kind of responsibility to advocate on behalf of the group. And once in a while you want to take a break. And then once you start doing it, other people start expecting you to keep doing it. What do all Black people think about that, Mike? Like, come on. You know what I mean? What do all Asian people think about that, Anthony? That's kind of crazy. So I know a lot of people want to jump right in. So I know. See, now I'm nervous that you corrected me how to say your name. I say your name wrong. It's Farah.
Yes.
All right. So Farah, I know you wanted to jump in, and then Officer Kwok, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mike and everyone. I think one of the things that, we've seen at Arab American Family Support Center is, with systemic racism, discrimination, and everything, it has negative implications on our mental health, right? And with that, when we experience stressors, anxieties, traumas, we're not able to, process as well as we can. We're not able to think critically. And I think, with the Asian American community, Asian American, Pacific Islander, South Asian American communities, we don't show or talk about how we're affected, especially when it comes to our mental health. It's a kind of taboo to talk about it. And so a lot of the times our communities just find support through, one of the ways that we can practice allyship to support the Asian American communities and other communities is by providing the resources. It's not just mental health resources, it's community resources that are supportive, that help people find jobs, that help people, find education, that help people, with financially, right? And a lot of our agencies that are on the ground, when we're working with our communities, it can, sometimes be overwhelming because we don't always have the staff to, help people cope with the traumas, because again, our communities are very communal, and we find support within one another, and to have those spaces is often very hard to find that. So, but we're seeing that in activist spaces, right? Whenever this year has seen a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, a lot of mental health implications for our communities. However, with solidarity, with allyship, and with support from people who are on the ground providing resources, it's one step towards, making it better for Asian American communities so that we don't have to be alone in our fight in processing trauma or stress or anything like that.
Thank you for that. Officer Kwok, you wanted to jump in. I think Sonny, you wanted to say something as well after.
Yes. All right. So, I mean, one of the key things I think Anthony really hit it on the head is, amongst the Asian communities, there is almost if you would call it like a stigma of speaking out when something happens to them. It's a little bit scary to think about that. As a police officer, I reach out to a lot of the communities, and part of what I do when I do my presentations is to teach the Asian community that it's okay to reach out to us. And I really want to make sure that our audience understands this too, because this is such a critical part of why the Asian community also doesn't reach out. Besides it being that stigmatic sort of thing, there's also a genuine fear by a lot of the AAPI community, because some of them are immigrants, and whether legality wise aside, there's a concern that, hey, if I get the police involved, will that affect my legal status? And I want to make sure that that's clearly heard through all our attendees, and even beyond that, so they can tell their friends as well. The police department, we don't ask about immigration status. We never did. We never will. And we want to make that clear, because we want, again, to make sure that they know that that they can report crimes to us. Part of the healing process when something traumatic happens to you is a sort of sense of justice. Who did this to me, and whether or not they're brought to justice. And a lot of times we're finding that it's very difficult to fulfill that side of it, because we don't know that crimes are happening. Because a lot of times, again, these communities aren't adjusted to speaking with the police to report a crime. So it's something that part of that trauma that we talk about, in order to heal on that, we want to be able to help with that. And we have a lot of resources, again, on the ground. We have an Asian hate crimes task force. We have people who are genuinely interested in trying to help resolve these things. So, I want to put it out there to let people know, you can let us know what's going on, and not have to worry about, all those outside stressors. And, and that's something to consider.
Let me just add that, the Y has been instrumental. We have a New Americans Welcome Center, and in Flushing, they serve a large population of the Asian community. And it starts with, as some of the other panelists talked about, the language barrier, getting folks to be acclimated to the language, then creating opportunities for education, and then creating opportunities for jobs. Also getting through the red tape of citizenship. All of those things are the things that keep people that are oppressed, that come to this country and then they don't find the quote unquote American dream. That's what keeps them sort of down. And the Y has been really good. We have New American Centers in 3 of the boroughs, and the one in Flushing has been very instrumental in that way. So I think it's an important point you're raising.
Cedric, just really quick, I apologize. I didn't want to just cut back in real quick, but I'm so glad that you mentioned the language thing, because I kind of forgot to mention it. Also, nowadays, when we call 911, 911 dispatch is equipped with that language line. So even if they are a new immigrant, they're still adapting to the language. We have a lot of languages that when you do try to reach out to us, we try to make it comfortable, to make sure that when you're reporting an incident, whether it's a crime, whether you're a witness, whether you're not necessarily directly involved, we want you to be comfortable reaching out to us. So again, even if they reach out to that 911 and they're calling 911, they don't have to necessarily speak English, because we have so many languages that are available when you call in to be able to talk to you and get the information to help you with whatever is happening.
So real quickly, Shaquan, I'm gonna let you jump in, but I just want to let those who are online watching, and we have a couple of questions from the YouTube chat. If you want to ask a question, make sure that you log into your YouTube account so you can get to the chat in YouTube, and you can send us your questions. But Shaquan, go ahead and do yours. Now I'll read the question after you.
Thank you. It was mentioned a lot about dealing with trauma and a lot of the experiences that have happened, historically, but even in this past year. And one thing I wanted to mention is that at the Commission on Human Rights, we are offering this series called Walking Towards Healing. And what it is we're doing restorative circles for particularly, we have started with students in New York City public schools, and working with Asian American Pacific Islander students to process what they've been seeing and also build community amongst each other. So in these circles, they are able to talk about those things. And oftentimes, it can be a very heavy space for them, but by the end of the space, they're able to really discuss how they can support each other through those things. And a lot of the healing that needs to happen also has to happen within these communities in terms of building community. But yeah.
So I'm going to try to paraphrase these two questions together. So the first part of it is, can someone talk about the uptick in the amount of Asian crimes or Asian violence against Asians that happened during the pandemic? And the other part of the question was talking about how they worked at CBO and that a lot of the staff were very aspirated about the Asian community, I guess, and how they did not come out early enough to help others. So anyone?
When you said aspirated, did you mean exasperated?
Exasperated, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
cool. I just wanted to
Exasperated, I'm
okay,
sorry.
okay.
So Scott, would you mind if I just interject for 1 second and I'll get to the question?
Right.
So I'll bring it full circle. You asked the question, who is the who, right? Who is the they when it comes to these things? The they are the ones who actually instituted systemic racism in this country. So slavery, glass ceilings, suppression of voices. And I think in terms of building allyship, it is one where recognizing that we are not the they is important to develop that type of relationship and addressing issues of systemic inequity. So I believe that that's important to recognize as we start to talk about allyship in general. And when you just put it into concrete terms, the they is they're the ones who actually reinforce the economy, right? The 1%, providing access to resources. Slavery was actually born out of an economic system. It wasn't racism. It was born out of an economic system with racism as sort of a product of it, to distinguish those who are human who are not human, those who are laborers and who are bosses. So when we start thinking about who perpetuates these myths, these images of particularly people of color, women, the LGBT community, we have to think about this whole system of providing access to resources and opportunities and what's preventing us from getting access to opportunities. So that's sort of a broad answer to your question about the day.
So I'm not letting you off the hook, Sonny. I'm not letting you off the hook on this one. But once again, to my point, it goes back to us because we have some of our own culture in that 1%. Am I right?
Yes,
okay?
Absolutely.
So we're actually hurting ourselves at the same time. Am I correct in saying that? It's about the dollar and not the person or the group of people. It's about the economic wealth that is the who.
I would actually say that we are replicating a system of inequity. So I think it's about the system of inequity. And obviously there are outliers in that process, right? Yeah, I mean it's impossible to be completely exclusive and yet claim to be a democratic society. So you put in place opportunities for access for some, even if they don't look or act or talk like you. And so I think that's part of it. It's actually saying that we are not racist at the end of the day, by holding up these exemplary members of underrepresented communities, right? They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They beat all odds. But systemically, there has been a history of exclusion and discrimination and barriers to access for communities of color. And I think as part of developing allies and actually processing trauma as a community, as marginalized and underrepresented communities, we have to have these conversations like we're having tonight. That we are not just we are not, as Anthony said, we're not the only ones that feel this way. And that's what actually brings us together, that we're part of a system that we feel like we're on a hamster wheel every single day of our lives, right? How come things aren't getting better? How come I can't progress? How come our communities can't progress? It's because we aren't having conversations about change and transformation. I think, and I don't want to sound ageist about it, but I think Farah's and Jerry's generation certainly are the ones that are pushing the envelope, and Shaquan, sorry, are really pushing, and Kenny, sorry. I don't even want to call out the older folks in the room. So I'll start with the young ones.
God, I have never felt so old.
I know.
That's so funny. And it's all
I'm
relative because I
deceptively
always
very
call
young.
on Jerry.
But
It's all
you're the
relative.
ones who are actually pushing the envelope more so than ever because you're actually being educated about systemic racism. You're actually being educated about microaggressions. You're actually being educated about discrimination and bias and implicit bias. And so these conversations, with the hope that these continue and that actually leads to policy change and organizational change and resources for folks. I think that's where the positivity will come out of. It's that we're actually having these conversations very, very sadly because we saw a man get killed on TV. Because we see the violence every single day almost in the news reports against the AAPI community. It's brutal. It's brutal to see this stuff. And it's sensationalism, right? The media, it's all about sensationalism at the end of the day for the media. But at the same time, it's actually becoming a catalyst for these types of discussions to take place. So, Scott, I don't know if I answered your question, but the they is an economic system. It's an economic system that's rooted in equity.
I'm not disagreeing, but I think I have to say add a little bit more nuance there, or at least I think I have to slightly differ in the sense of, yes, definitely there's economic system, but we were just talking about, yes, we can talk about whether race is real, but racism is very much real, right? And so I think in a sense it's in the United States, it's hard to talk about it because a lot of times what is actually a classism, meaning economic difference, a lot of times that's sort of talked in terms of racism. But there's a reason for that because a lot of times it sort of goes along the race line. It doesn't always do it that way. But so it's, I think, in a sense, having to talk about both. And another thing that I think is important to talk about in terms of actually in response to the audience question is that yes, we are not part of they. And, that's actually really important, partly to sort of have a reality check of they're never going to accept all of us as they, so in the sense of we are understanding that, yes, we are minorities and we have, obstacles and we actually share that experience. But at the same time, the reason it's hard to talk about who exactly they are is because also we know that we have some internalized racism and some internalized biases that we have, against each other. I mean, to be honest, even within AAPI communities, that exists, the kind of biases that, my parents have against certain other ethnic groups and me fighting against and all that. And so, and let alone, outside of the tension between AAPI communities and Black communities, as much as there's a lot of, interaction and solidarity, that also exists. And so I think that's why the question of they is really hard, is because in a sense, it's not a human being that's controlling over there. It's a framework and system and the way we think. And we all have, unfortunately, very sadly, have a little bit of that they, that influence. And that's something that we internally also have to recognize and work on. And that's partly why, AAPI violence is not just committed by, for instance, white people, right? It's it's a hard question to answer. And sometimes I see a very racist comment from actually AAPI communities on, the way they perceive the anti-Asian violence and what that means. And, it's not about certain groups against others and, just one group going against the other. It's much more complicated than that. So that's just something that I wanted to mention.
Come on, Farah. I see you. I see you, Farah. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I wanted to also jump in, and I agree with what a lot of Jean said, and also wanted to touch on what Jean said. When we have, so growing up, all of our communities, and this isn't just recent with me, but historically, whoever, is in power at the time and who holds the most power, whether it's because of their race, their socioeconomic status, their sexuality, whatever it may be, right? They're the ones who dictate how we perceive one another, right? Because we come here and we learn from this group, from the group in power, how other groups are typically treated. And we kind of learn from behavior, right? We mimic other groups and how they treat Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, etc. So I think, there is anti-Blackness in the South Asian and Asian communities. There is anti-Asian bias in the Black communities, Latinx communities, but we learned this from them, right? Not from our own groups, but from the group in power. So I think the first thing that we do need is education, right? And that's not just educating ourselves, but we need a curriculum that's anti-racist and touches on Asian American history and Black American history and Native American history and Latinx history, and shows how we all did at one point support one another in small ways, right? We spoke about Malcolm X and how there was Asian American supporters. I forget the name of the woman, but the Japanese American woman who was there and was one of his supporters. And similarly, it's all intersectional. Like everything that we are experiencing is because of our socioeconomic class, is because of our race, is because of our gender identity, is because of our sexuality. And so, the one thing that I do want to address with that question is that, with the question asked is that, it is going to take a lot of time for the Asian American communities to come and support Black and Latinx communities, and vice versa as well, because we have grown up thinking that, we're supposed to be against each other when really we're supposed to be with one another. And I think a lot of that is just, there's going to be a lot of work, but you see it now in the younger generation, even younger than me and Kenny and Jerry and everybody else and Shaquan. I see a lot of youth there recognizing that we all share, even though there are differences between our groups, we all share some similarities and we celebrate those similarities. So, I do have hope that eventually, we can all support one another without having to question why one group is not supporting another, and that we can truly go towards that anti-racist and justice-oriented society.
So Kenny, from a civil rights grouping, how's the NAACP, how are they addressing this issue?
I think I always find it interesting. It's been a conversation I'm having a lot with my peers and just in general, as far as what to do in situations where we need to come together. So right now, there's a real big campaign with Stop Asian Hate. And it's something we should all be behind. It's something every community should be coming together to address. But, the first question is oh, where was the Asian community with Black Lives Matter? But then I have to turn and ask that same person, where were you for Black Lives Matter? And it's people with like minds end up finding each other, right? So I know the Asian community has been down with civil rights because I'm in that life. I've participated with groups like AAPI and Wycasec and some of the community and legislators that are in office that are on board with making sure that there's equality for everybody. And I think we need to we keep talking about education and knowing the history. And it's although I didn't know about the Yellow Tigers before today, I knew about these other organizations that have been in the struggle. And, it's we really need to engage our own communities so that we can bring everybody together. So it's not only the person who's in NAACP knows that the Asian community is out for Black Lives Matter, but everybody in the Black community knows that there are Asians out for Black Lives Matter. And everybody in the Asian community needs to know that the Black community and the Latino community and the other communities are rallying behind them when they're being severely discriminated against. But unfortunately, that isn't happening enough. And I think, to what Farah was saying as well, this new generation, this younger generation we have more access, to information and just to each other. It's I don't see necessarily groups of the same people hanging out and going to protests and things of that nature anymore. You're starting to see a more diverse group of younger people that are stepping up into leadership positions, whether it's in their community, in organizations, or just collaborating together to seek information that they don't know. And I think that those are some important things that we need to watch and observe as we continue this this journey to learning our own histories and each other's history.
So Kenny, I'm really glad you mentioned all that. And I think, I think a common theme here that we're talking about is that, the way that you dismantle racism and fight through implicit bias is with information and connection. And it's telling our stories, right? So, whether it's, learning about the history of the AAPI community, the African American community, the Latinx community, or the religious communities, and then also finding those stories where there has been, interconnection, right? I mean, that's why, at our agency's event today, we made it a point to talk about where there was some Black Asian solidarity. And there was also a snippet where we talk about the Filipino farm workers joining with Cesar Chavez, to form the United Farm Workers group. And that there are these moments that have happened where groups have worked together, but even present day, and I know, Kenny, you referred to some of the groups that you worked in Flushing, like AAPI and Waikusek, which is now Minquan, right? It's telling these stories that there are connections today too between communities who are fighting together for civil rights, for social justice. And, I think that's another reason why I was so happy that we get this panel together, because I think this is part of that storytelling and part of sharing our histories and the learning that has to happen. And, you're right, definitely with social media today and access to information, some of these stories can maybe circulate even more quickly, and hopefully to make a dent in any implicit bias or misinformation that people may feel around different communities and their relationships to each other.
I also think, and I agree with everything that's been said, but there was something that sort of resonated as I was listening to people. And, we talked, the question came up about the violence that has happened, to our Asian community. And I thought about three things that have been sort of the ingredients for a lot of this violence. And one is trauma, disenfranchised, and racism and bias. I think that combination has become a very potent ingredient. In New York City and across many of our cities, we have a lot of mentally ill people out there. Let's not always assume that this is just about sensible people who just decide to go out and attack somebody. We have a lot of trauma from a lot of different angles in all of our cultures. And much of what I've been seeing on the news, and even like I work with transitional housing clients, and literally 1,000 beds in the YMCA, and I see the trauma that people are carrying. And that trauma oftentimes translates to behavior. And that behavior can be perpetuated by something as simple as the last 4 years of a president who has vilified a race of people. And sometimes things take 2 or 3 years to percolate themselves to the point where they are now. We say something yesterday and it's not till 3 days later when it really synergizes itself. And I think that's a lot of it. I'd be curious, from our officer here, Officer Kwok, is that what you're seeing? Are you seeing a lot of mentally ill folks out here really committing many of these crimes?
So yes, we are seeing a good amount of it. It belabors the point that that there is something that goes outside of just police work. Yes, we can try to stop. We can try to do our best to stop crimes from happening, but when you are dealing with an individual that may need mental assistance, you don't know when that happens. As an officer who have about a little bit over 8 years on the job, I have been to many situations where we have an individual that has a mental issue, and it's almost like a ticking time bomb. You don't know if this person, he might be good right now. I've had someone where I'm in the room, I'm talking to them, I've got him to calm down, and then the ambulance gets there, they got him, he gets to the ambulance, and he's sitting inside the ambulance, and all of a sudden, just like a powder keg, he just goes off. And so it's a very tough sort of situation, and it becomes it almost becomes like a narrative, if you would, sometimes for people to just kind of like use that and kind of ignore certain elements in it to perpetuate what they want to necessarily say about why these things are happening. And it's something that I want to talk about a little bit before too. Kenny, I think you hit it on the head. We have so much access to information. It makes things better because then people learn about things quickly. But in a sense, it also does sometimes become a little bit overwhelming, and people take it again, at face value. And when you do that, you're doing yourself a disservice, because when you don't do the due diligence on it, that makes you easily susceptible to misinformation as well. And that's what we have to be careful, because that's also what's causing a little bit of this divisiveness between everyone, is that sort of misinformation that can get carried out there, and I think it's very critical, that we take the time to, as it was said before, to percolate some of this information, take it in, and really try to fully understand what it is, and maybe do a little extra research. We shouldn't take it at immediately, this is the first thing I heard, this must mean it's right. Because we've seen time and time again where the initial situation that happens is different once more information comes out, once more, once more people come forward, or more different scenarios play out, then we find out, oh, the initial one was a little bit quick to judge. So I think that part of us improving on our relations as races also depends on us making sure that we educate ourselves. We can't count on outside sources to educate us. We need to be able to take information in and and analyze it, and then become more informed and educated as a result of it.
I'm right with you. I think that makes a lot of sense. And staying on this for a minute with what you said, Officer Kwok, and I hope I'm correctly receiving what Gene was saying earlier. And one of the themes I've heard consistently throughout too is like, even thinking about prior barbershop, is saying like, check the source of information, and you invest your own time in analysis and in what's going on, and like, do I even really believe in this narrative? Like, we have to continually check in with the who's the they thing, and as you're saying, check in with the information. So one thing I want to touch on, and maybe you want to jump back on this, Officer Kwok or others, when we talk about hate, we talk about hate crimes. There's the crime and there's the hate. And I was talking earlier about unlikely allies, and I'd be in this dialogue with a couple of them about hate crimes, as if we're somehow scapegoating people, because what about personal responsibility? And I get this one a lot too. It's like, you talk about Black Lives Matter. What about black on black violence or whatever? And I have presented at times the statistics. White people are most likely to hurt white people. Black people are most likely. I phrase that in a clumsy way. I'm sorry. When you look at the incidence of crime, most intimates have engaged in violence against people of their own racial group. That's a much better way to put it. So most of the crime that occurs is white against white, black people, right? So it's all problematic. And if you hurt someone violently, it's all crime, right? So one of the things I retort is, we have to look at why things are happening, even though, yes, you have to look at personal responsibility. Individual actors are choosing to act. But like what Cedric was saying a moment ago, microaggressions and other things build up. We could be mad at somebody about something that happened yesterday. We could be dwelling on things that have been happening for months or for years or for generations. I was talking with my wife last night about how Black people, unfortunately, this is one fact that I do know, have ingested a lot of trauma, right? So that even if you haven't indirectly, it's like the kind of vicarious trauma. Like you're gonna be dealing with vicarious trauma because you know what's happened to other Black people. So all that stuff is going on. There's still individual responsibility, but how do we intelligently unpack the hate crime part of the crime, which to me has a lot to do with stereotype, bad information that we've not critically unpacked. And now we're acting, first of all, violence is wrong, but we're acting against another group because of misinformation, right? Whereas the the violence we do within our community, we could spend another 2 hours just on that too. It's not that it's more painful or less painful. It's just we have to understand, if we're going to intervene, what's the nature of what it is that we're trying to confront. Does anybody understand what I'm trying to say? Because I'm not saying it very well. I'm worried.
No, I think you said it well, Mike. We have to look internally, and I would say, well, no, I don't want to, because it's going to be my closing monologue. But before I do my closing monologue, Anthony, I think it's going to be you. I want to bring up some slides that we have. And David, if you can get ready to pull up the deck of some historical people that we want to show. And I guess, Anthony, I guess you'll be the one to kind of take us through this the slide deck. Am I correct, Anthony?
I didn't know I was doing this part, but I'll jump in. If it's from our presentation earlier, that's fine. It's all good.
Don't get me in trouble, Anthony. I want you to don't get me later. But,
no one's in trouble here. No one's
okay.
in trouble here.
Fernando told me to do it, so.
All right, so I think when we were putting this event together, we were also thinking about what's the role of art in building relationships across community. What's the role of art in terms of healing and addressing issues and trying to bring up what's the role of art in bringing about change. And I think this is, if people haven't seen this artwork, this is artwork from a woman named Amanda Pingbody Pakia. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She is of Thai and Indonesian heritage. She is actually a public artist in residence at the City Commission on Human Rights. So I'm sure Shaquan definitely is aware of this work. And I think what's remarkable about her work was it really came out at a time where a few months ago it was at the height of the anti-Asian incidents. And her artwork just tells it all. It's basically the theme of her artwork is don't scapegoat us, right? And we're not why we're in this pandemic, the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I think what's really striking about her artwork is it's very visual. It's also in some ways shows the resiliency, and it also just shows images of Asian Americans, right? Because it's while we have more images in the media now of Asian Americans, there's still not enough at times. So I know for me personally, I've felt very touched by this artwork and feel like it just really represents a lot of what we in the Asian American Pacific Islander community have felt over the past year of the pandemic, when the scapegoating started, back when it started, when the pandemic started, right? And there were incidents of violence and hate incidents even last year. And even right when the pandemic started, for some of the first businesses that lost business were businesses in Asian neighborhoods across the city, like Chinatown and Flushing, right? So, this scapegoating started at the beginning of the pandemic, and it just touched these raw nerves around how, as I think we've discussed on this call, and I know Sonny through his history has talked about exclusion, right? The yellow peril, right? That there have been times when Asian Americans have been deemed a threat, right? And continue to be from certain segments of the society, right? They're the other, they're gonna, overtake our economy, the economies in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, right? So, so I think this is an example of artwork trying to speak to the moment and speak out and speak against hate and discrimination.
Thank you, Anthony. Dave, you can take that down. So let's bring everybody back. So we have to come to the close, and I already saw a couple people said, is there going to be a part 2 to this? And it probably needs to be a part 10, 12, 13, because we definitely have to get to this solution. We have an opportunity that is here now. We can't let it go. I can tell you, I guess, and doing some studying about history, how these opportunities have come up and they've died out and things have gone back to what they have been in the past. But I think at this time, this place, we're here, we have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to make a difference. So with that, as we get ready to close, I'm gonna ask my panelists, can you give me something that from your lens or from your idea, what can we do or what could you do to help to move the agenda that we can become a more harmonious community, loving each other, working together, and moving this needle in the right direction? So Gene, I'm gonna start with you.
I was about to say, just because there was a lot of like hip hop and martial art reference, I was like, more Wu-Tang Clan, please.
Yeah.
RZA and Sophia Chang, we need them.
That was the
next.
top rope comment. Somebody always says something. I'm like, from the Tajin from the top rope. Yes,
Yeah.
Wu-Tang Clan is nothing to trifle with.
But, yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of it is just, genuine appreciation of each other and trying to learn about each other. When, Cedric was talking about like working with, and others here, like working with like, sort of being close with Asian communities, like that was just like meant so much to me as somebody who, when we first moved here, my mom actually didn't add garlic to kimchi because she was so worried about what other people would think of our smell. And so I think just the fact that like somebody was like in the community and doing all that is like, obviously that means a lot to me, means a lot to us, and I should be doing the same about other communities, both within and outside of API, definitely Black communities and beyond. So, that's sort of how I see as like our future, steps that we should be taking. Thank you for, inviting me again. This was great talk.
Officer Williams? I can't say your last name, so I got to call you Officer Williams.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you so much. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we could do. I mean, we've been stressing, I think, throughout this entire barbershop, the need for education, the need for us to take the time to properly make sure that we're not falling to misinformation. I think that's a key thing, because once you're able to start educating yourself, then you can start educating others. And that's such a tremendous part of it. And I think that in doing that, that will start to lead inroads towards towards that sort of the ability for us to all unite under one. And that's going to be the key thing. So I just want to make sure that again, thank you guys so much for having me here for this. I think I actually picked up a lot of information, a different insight. And I appreciate it. So thank you.
Farah?
So yeah, I think the best way to kind of get towards that harmonious world we want is, as Officer Kwok said, and as Jean said, education, and I think a lot more solidarity and allyship and advocacy. I think those, when we educate ourselves about our histories, the significance of our cultures, and just looking sociologically, psychologically at everything that's happening around us and our communities, that's where we learn to create connections and support one another and build each other up. And so that's where the solidarity and allyship come in. I think, and resources, all of those can help us build a better community, better society, especially not just for Asian Americans, but Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Native Americans, and more. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. Shaquan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I would definitely say education. And I would say education, particularly in schools. I know for us at the commission, we provide workshops, but also like educating students on the history of AAPI people, and then also providing space for students to be in community, not just in a reactive way. So not just when things happen, but before that, throughout the year. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Kimmy Ken.
I think one of the greatest things that I've realized in navigating how to deal with what's going on in the Asian community right now is how much interaction the Black community has with the Asian community on a daily basis. It's like we all have an Asian Chinese restaurant in our neighborhood. We all have Asian nail technicians that we go to for services, and we have that dependency on each other every day, but we don't capitalize and use that to our advantage. It's like recently, and I'll give a quick story, go to the same Chinese food spot all the time. And this one time I realized they have new dumplings and I love dumplings. So I asked the lady who takes the order about these new dumplings. And she was so excited that I liked the new dumplings. She talked to me for a good 10, 15 minutes, which never happens. And had I not broke that barrier of communication and just had a simple conversation, wasn't about anything deep, it was about some dumplings. We were able to, now we're best friends. Every time I go in there, she asks about my family, I ask about hers, and just a simple conversation that broke a barrier between us. So capitalize off of our daily interactions and just have a conversation.
Cedric.
I guess I'll just sort of take it to where my experience, which was the Flushing Y again, and spirit, mind, and body. I think those are common denominators amongst all of us. Family, friends, and health are common denominators amongst all of us. And I think when you go inside of the doors of your local community center, your local church, your local whatever, I think if we just focus just on starting there, starting on our spirit, our mind, and our body, and connecting ourselves to each other on those things, they are very simple, very unifying conversations. And what we'll find is how much we are so much alike. And I think that similarity will continue to unify us. I became richer and fuller in my time in the Flushing Y, interacting with the Asian community. They taught me so much about so many little things that I took for granted. Again, I want to thank this panel, the other members of the panel, because you all taught me something in your conversation, but also want to thank you, Scott, always for inviting me to be a part of it.
Dr. Sunny, you're a doctor, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, this is such a heartening panel to be on, and not just because, as I mentioned, I'm a fan, but because of the conversation and the depth and the breadth of what we covered. I think what's really important is really advocating, as I believe Kenny was mentioning, really thinking about how do we institute curricularly in our schools, and Shaquan as well, curricularly in our schools, an opportunity to learn about the other, us being the other. I'm gonna reclaim that word. We're the other. And I think it's important that those conversations do take place in the classroom and are evaluated. We need to mandate in many ways as part of our K through 12, and then eventually throughout higher education, opportunities to learn about our different histories, our different cultural traditions, our different political movements, and how we actually have converged at certain points, as Anthony was mentioning. And that builds coalitions immediately. So even beyond that, it's just having casual conversations like tonight about these particular issues. And then how do you operationalize some of this work? I mean, I'm looking at Cedric. I'm like, I actually want to hang out with all of you. Don't get me wrong, but I want to hang out with Cedric to hear a little bit more about the work that the Y has been doing in terms of helping new immigrants navigate the immigration process. I mean, that's advocacy work. That's not just paperwork, that's advocacy work. So finding those types of opportunities to support brothers like Cedric and his efforts, and Shaquan and obviously Gene and his efforts. And I know, of course, what Anthony and Mike do every day, and everybody else here. And then also supporting what Officer Kwok does. I think it's important that we show up and we're there for one another. And then we listen to the stories of the work that we do. So I think it's starting with education, starting with conversation, and then a whole lot of support for one another, and really being there for one another, I think is really important. But thank you again. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you, Sonny. And Anthony, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. I believe in you. I'm so happy that you stood with us and let us get to this point. Anthony, really, really appreciate you. We're going to have to find a way of building a chair just for you in this barbershop, because I think you should be a part of it. You're a key focal person around me. I know it because, I pass your office and we just start chit-chatting about life, and I appreciate that. So any last words, Anthony? Thank you again.
Well, again, yeah, Scott, definitely appreciate getting to know you all the years and how we've worked on some things over the years with your fatherhood program. I know I've always been inspired to hear about the work that many of your providers do. And it's just been great to build with you over the years. And then now to be part of this panel. I think a lot of folks have said it, right? It starts with education, it starts with conversations, it starts with learning, it starts with keeping our minds open, right? And having that commitment to engage. So, that's my hope for all of us, right, as we move forward. I definitely, thinking about some of the question earlier about how do we build a more harmonious society together, right? I know that we talked a lot about how our communities need to engage with each other, but I know that, we also do some work within our own communities. And I know that definitely it was mentioned earlier, like in the Asian American community, there are segments of the Asian American community that, are anti-Black, anti-other people of color, and who, and some of that maybe is because of some of their own lack of information, right? So some of that work within our communities has to happen too, while we're doing the work with communities as well. So, again, that is still hitting on the theme of education, information, engagement, and time. We need to spend the time to listen to each other and build these relationships, because that's the only way it'll happen. You can't do this overnight. Right? You got to carve out the time and have some intention around it. So, listen, I'm game. I'm down. If you want to have a part 2 for this, if you want to have me back with some other barbershops on some other topics, I'm down for that too. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the barbershop and the barbershop talks events that we at DYCD have been able to create over the past year. The ability to connect. So thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you, Scott, Jerry, Mike, David, pulling this together. Again, as I said earlier, I was really touched when you all reached out and said, hey, let's do a special barbershop talks for AAPI Heritage Month. So thank you.
So Mike and Jerry, we're coming to the close of another barbershop. We have so many things to be thankful for, and just want you all to say your last words, Jerry and Mike. I guess Jerry, you go first, and then Mike, I want you to say a little bit about what our next barbershop is coming up, because we're getting down to dirty real quickly. We got a lot of stuff to cover in these next couple of days or weeks, really days. But Jerry, how you feeling?
Man, I feel great. It's so good to be back in the barbershop. I feel like I got a fresh cut of just gems of just being open and just learning and getting so much information about my brothers and sisters, right? The AAPI community is just so beautiful. And if there's anything I want to add to it, is really I want to just sit on some things that Sunny said and Shaquan said as well, which is one, critical race theory. That should be a part of curriculum across the board. So you should advocate for that. A part of just history lesson across the board. Critical race theory should be something that's a part of just our educational system. Again, K through 12. This isn't one person's history. This is all of our history. You cannot talk about Frederick Douglass, right, if you don't talk about Wong King art, right? Like those are some things that we are interconnected, and this is just a part of our history. The other part is critical thinking, right? As you get information, because social media is so amazing, you need to be able to be trusted with the advantage of connecting, and we want all of us to connect. But as you get information, use some little critical thinking. We don't want to be professional reactionists, right? So that when we do make decisions, collective decisions, we can make informed ones. And with that, I'm just excited about just the information I got, the information that everyone else received, and just being able to be a part of this conversation. So I'll give it to Mike.
Thanks, Jerry. You'll save me time by letting me just say I co-sign on what you said. There's a lot of gems to get. Yeah, as always, I appreciate the panelists. It's nice to be able to share. It's nice to be able to listen and learn. One thing I'm struck by now that we've started doing this for a period of time, and if you haven't caught these, we're archiving on YouTube, so you should go back and look. But we did a session on La Familia, we did a session on Black History Month, and here we are doing Asian American Pacific Islander heritage. And to Anthony's point, Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We couldn't have left this month without doing this because it's important to talk about representation and live what we talk about, to have different people in the barbershop and make sure everyone in the community knows we're talking to each other and we're talking to you. So get to know something just like we got to know something new today, and tell a friend, you know? Speaking of telling a friend, the pace of the barbershops has been crazy, and I want to acknowledge David and Jermaine and Scott and Jerry and everybody who's been sustaining this. We were doing these about once a month. We've done 2 this week. And we're going to turn right back around next week and do another one. So I know you can always catch us the last Tuesday of the month, but we're going to do another very special barbershop. And we haven't been on Facebook Live in a while. So it's going to end up archived back on YouTube. If you're looking for us next Thursday, June 3rd, we're going to be focusing on NYC Youth Vax Week. So there's going to be a whole bunch of events around the city. If you're listening live, listen, June 3rd through 6th is NYC Youth Vaccine Week. And we're going to do a special barbershop just to talk about that. So we'll have a whole new group of people in the chairs next week. Look for us on social media. And again, we archive these on YouTube. So if you have trouble finding us, look on Facebook, but catch up with us later on YouTube, and we'll be back with the regular sessions on YouTube. But next Thursday, June 3rd, 6 to 8, Youth Facts Week. You don't want to miss it. Tell your kids, tell your parents to make decisions about who is going to get vaccinated. Catch us next week in the barbershop. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there. I know we went a little bit over time, and I'm trying to stop because, I need to restrain myself. We about 8 minutes past 8. I want to keep talking. I want to keep going. I make myself stop right there. Send it back to you, Scott.
So I want to let everybody know, I live in America. We all live in America. This is our homeland. This is where we want to be. This is where the land we love. This is the land that we enjoy being a part of. As it is said from a famous singer, it all starts with the man in the mirror. This is going to start with us. We're not going to get it right away. But if me, the man in the mirror, the person in the mirror, if I could take the time out to learn and to fact find what's going on before I react, I can be part of making a better America. We really talk about that this is the land of the free. We are the melting pot of the world. But are we living that? Can we be advocates to our own and be supporters to others? This is what we have to do to make America great again. So with that saying, see you next week at the barbershop with the Youth Vax Fund. Please reach your youth who are out there. We're gonna bust some myths that we found information about that are not true about the vaccine. We're gonna help encourage people who need to get vaccinated, because if it's not you getting vaccinated, it's just like we're talking today about helping the next person. You don't know who you're going to help by getting vaccinated and being taken care of. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and can't get it. So with that saying, see you later till next time at the barbershop.